It's great to be here, and it's great to see Amitav even online again. It has been a long while, so and it's great to be part of the discussion. And I think, in a way, I was very fortunate to be a kind of a witness of the launching of the initial project, why there is no non-Western IR in Singapore back in 2004. So looking back, it has almost been like 20 years. So we can actually look back and take stock of what has been achieved, and then looking forward to what kind of things we can do in the future. So my brief kind of talk will be have a title. It's called Revisioning Global IR Toward a Emancipating Body of Knowledge, which I actually explicitly borrowed from one of Amitav's very early contributions, which I will mention in the following discussion. So I will divide my talk into kind of two parts. The first part will be really like my own take, or kind of taking stock, kind of looking back, at what kind of things Global IR has been able to achieve since 2004. And the second part will be is really looking forward, right? So let me begin by, with the first part, Global IR, the creation of a movement. So I must admit, I'm not sure even Amitav or Barry Buzan were actually consciously aware they were actually launching a movement back in 2004. So I was very fortunate to be part of this movement since the very beginning, in a way. So back in 2004, Amitav and Barry Buzan organized a conference in Singapore. It's called Why There Is No Non-Western IR. So I was visiting the Eastern Asian Institute in Singapore, National University of Singapore back then. So Amitav and Barry were really kind to invite me to be part of the conference, which I was serving as a commentator for Professor Qin Yaqing's nice paper. So Professor Qing was contributing a chapter called Why There Is No Chinese IR Theory. So eventually the project actually was published by as a special issue at International Relations of Asia Pacific, IRAP, and then eventually a book in Routledge. So it's Non-Western IR Theory, Perspectives on and Beyond Asia. So I'm actually very welcoming that Amitav and Barry eventually decide they use the name Global IR, which I think is more inclusive, and which I will actually talk about in the second part. Now, so in a way, I think I was fortunate to be part of the movement since the very beginning, and I think it has been a very stimulating and very rewarding experience for me to be part of this movement. Now, one thing which I think we should acknowledge is I think the Global IR movement has really found comrades in many parts of the world, perhaps even in the United States. So that was a very significant achievement. Now, in a way, also, Annie Ticker and Oli Weaver actually published another volume called International Relations Scholarship Around the World, which actually somewhat actually complement what Amitav and Barry were doing. And to some extent, Amitav had a very spirited kind of debate with David Kang on getting Asia wrong, was also part of this movement too. So by the time in 2013, 2014, when Amitav was elected as the first non-Western president of the ISA, so I would argue after almost 10 years, the movement has actually achieved some kind of significant following, right? So let me quote, below I actually quote, I'm going to quote some of the remarks Amitav wrote in his 2014 ISA presidential address, which was published by ISQ. So this is what he wrote, right? So the title of his presidential address was Global IR in the Regional Wars, a New Agenda for International Studies, right? So Amitav actually, in this particular piece, laid down a roadmap to some extent for advancing global IR. And here I quote. So broadly stated, the idea of global IR revolves around 6 main dimensions, right? First, it is founded upon a pluralistic universalism, not applying to all, but recognizing and respecting the diversity in us. Second, it's grounded in world history, not just Greco-Roman, European, or even US history. Third, it subsumes rather than supplements existing IR series and methods. Fourth, it integrates the study of regions, regionalism, and aerial studies. Fifth, it eschews exceptionalism. Sixth, and lastly, it recognizes multiple forms of agency beyond material power, including resistance, normative actions, and the local construction of global order. So now in 2022, after more than 3 years of hard work by the Working Group for Global International Relations section, actually ISA approves the creation of the Global IR section, in which Amitav is one of the senior advisors, and I was fortunate to be part of the one of the members of the executive committee. So I would argue after almost 2 decades since 2004, Global IR has become a movement. Now, of course, it's easy, well, not easy in reality, but it's relatively easier to start a movement, and it's more difficult to sustain it, right? So what kind of things we have achieved? So let me review some of the things we have been able to achieve, and then see what kind of things we may be able to achieve in the future, right? So I start with a simple observation. So if Amitav and Barry and many of his their colleagues have started a movement, it's our responsibility to sustain it if we believe Global IR is a useful and even more so constructive intellectual venture. Now, I would actually recall some of the points I made in a very short commentary back in 2016, which was part of the form in ISR, International Studies Review. I actually made 3 points, very practical forms for how can we advance global IR in the broader IR community. The first proposal or advice I suggested is actually journals under ISA should encourage submissions that draw from more than one country and even one region, and should include scholars from not only just from the IR Center, but also in the periphery. So I believe such a direction is consistent with what Amitav has in mind, and that region should be a very critical focus of IR theorization, and a comparative approach toward regions will be quite helpful. Second, I also argue that for most scholars in the periphery, the language barrier is real, right? So in order to be able to publish in leading journals, you have to write certainly decent English. So my suggestion or my advice was when editors of ISA journals see a piece from the IR periphery that really contains important knowledge, progress, but yet it's not really well written, then maybe the editors of those ISA journals can actually recommend a rejection and then invite the author to resubmit, and specifically ask authors to actually improve writing style, and actually perhaps even appoint an editorial member of the ISA journals to be, a kind of a guide or, mentor to a particular scholar from the periphery. And I would argue doing so will really foster real diversity in global IR. Now, I'm happy to inform you, I think the second recommendation has now been officially implemented by Security Study, which the journal actually being able to serve as a member of the editorial board. So actually Security Study has now started a policy. If a scholar from the Global South submit to Security Studies, and if the editors and reviewers find the topic and the contribution interesting enough, but needs sharpening and reframing, Security Studies actually now will be able to actually appoint a board member and a reviewer to guide the reject and then resubmit, revise and resubmit process. But unfortunately, I would argue ISQ has yet to really implement such a policy. Now, my first recommendation really didn't materialize that much. I would say So frequently, I would say ISQ, ISR mostly still publish journal articles contribution from one single country and one single region, and very few contribution unless they are really quantitative. You don't actually really examine more than one country in one region. Now, finally, actually, I made a third point in my short commentary back in 2016, and I would argue the power in academic gatekeeping, right? So what my specifically was able to argue was it may be desirable that editorial board of all ISA journals should actually have 10 or 20% of its members being from non-European descent and non-North American or even European based. And I would argue the same can be argued for book series by major university in the commercial press. Now, those leading journals, those book series should be edited by a mixture of typical American and European scholars, plus their non-European and non-American scholars. Now, certainly I would argue having scholars from the periphery serve as a member of the editorial board member does not really necessarily lower the academic standard of journals or book series. In my own experience, I actually have rejected about 95% of the articles being sent to review by myself. So, but I would argue, unfortunately, even this particular recommendation or suggestion has not been able to be implemented, right? So we still have most of journal editorial members from ISQ,
好，
ISR
敌对
leading
分子不
international.
来不来给他捧场，不来这个。
Somebody was
Sorry,
speaking.
I think, yeah.
Okay, so now let me continue, right? So, and I would argue in some of the leading journals, with perhaps the exception of international security and security studies, the journal like International Organization has zero non-European editors, board members from the editorial members. In the last, and actually I actually talk about it on Twitter, in the last year, they had actually had a special issue on international orders. And let me count, and I would argue only about 2 or 3 scholars from for that particular issue on international order have been able to come from non-Western countries. Right? So in summary, there are some positive changes, but not really much. Right? So the movement has been going on, but the real power structure in the global IR or the global IR community has not really been able to change that much. So some of the blames, I would argue, must go to the center, of course, but I would also argue some will go to the periphery. So the question is, what we should go from here. So the second part of my brief talk will be a new vision and a new agenda with a question mark. Now, it is only proper that I say these words in front of Amitabh. He had a vision. So I'm actually trying to build upon it, kind of revisioning global IR. Now, I would argue the mission of global IR is really to advance a body of knowledge that is truly emancipating. Therefore, global IR should be more inclusive beyond the West, which Amitabh has actually talked about in his talk, more insightful, I would argue, and more critical, but also more constructive, and therefore more emancipating. So here, I actually draw some inspirations from Roy Bhaskar, another great scholar from India, actually passed away a few years back. So in a way, global IR will actually embrace some kind of a synthesis of Karl Popper, Mikhail Foucault, via Roy Bhaskar, or what I called a part of neo-modernity. So it does not really reject modernity per se. It also embraces the critical approach or critical theory against modernity. But in order to advance human welfare, we cannot just only critique we actually have to construct and build, and therefore what I called a critical engagement with modernity, but also move beyond what has been a mostly Western-centric modernizational drive. So that's what I call neo-modernity. Now, let me elaborate some of the things I actually have said. So why it is more critical? So it is more critical in the sense it must be able to provide critique of the existing Western-centric, but also move beyond. It is inclusive in the sense that it must bring all the relevant history, knowledge, and practice into the domain. It must be more insightful in the sense that it uncovers, highlights, and extends insights from other civilizations, cultures, and tradition, so that we can avoid blind spots, identify suppression, oppression, and marginalization of the whole global south, so that we can have a better understanding of past, present, and perhaps construct a better future. It is both critical and constructive in the sense that we cannot just criticize some aspects of Western IR, but our own IR approach too, right? So perhaps Chinese IR scholars can actually criticize some of the IR approach in China, and Indian scholars or Brazilian scholars can actually criticize some of the IR development in their own countries or their own regions. Now, so we actually have to recognize that Western colonialism is part of a legacy, but our self-conscious kind of way of internalizing some of the Western dominance may be our own mistakes. And I'm actually going to allude to some of the, I would say, drawbacks of current economics and sociology in China, right? So we must construct and also deconstruct not only Western ideas, but also practice, but our own ideas and practice. Finally, it is emancipating in the sense that this new body of knowledge will liberate us from the confinement of Western IR, but our own ethnocentrism or our own civilization. So we actually have to move beyond not just Western IR, but also move beyond our own self-centric civilization. So therefore, to move us into a more equal playground for the future of humankind. So as I said, Amitabh actually himself wrote about emancipating IR in one of his very earliest articles with a fitting title, Ethnocentrism and Emancipatory IR Theory, back in 2000. Now, so for this particular night, because most of the members in the audience are from China, let me just have the following 8 points to make for most of the Chinese IR community. Now, the first thing I actually want to repeat is we actually have to move beyond Western-centric, but also Sino-centric perspectives. We should avoid talking about West versus others, China versus others, because once you do that, you're actually dividing the world into 2 camps or maybe 3 camps. So we actually need to avoid single civilization-centric studies. This is just as exclusive as a purely Western IR. So one cannot really hope to advance global IR by mostly examining Tianxia or the tributary system or China versus its nomadic enemies or neighbors. Second, we must engage with the Western-centric literature with sufficient knowledge or confidence, not ignorance, right? So here, allow me to share an exchange with Professor Wang Gengwu back in 2004 too, right? So I was giving a talk at EAI, and Professor Wang Gengwu was in the audience. He is one of the really most wonderful historians of our time. And he actually sat there and asked me, he said, Xiping, I heard what you have been able to talk about, but most of the ideas, most of the concepts are from the West. So what kind of things do you hope to achieve? So I actually had to pause for about 20 seconds and really think about an answer. What I was able to reply was this. I said, before you can, or before we can, or before I can critique and advance beyond Western IR, we actually have to know the literature. And therefore we can spot the weakness, spot the gap, spot the inconsistency. And therefore, once we have that, then we can bring our own perspective, but also perspective from, Asia, Africa, and Latin America into our civilization. So in a way, I think both Amitav and I have been able to engage with Western-centric IR literature with confidence and with sufficient knowledge, right? So Amitav himself, one can argue, has been a fairly mainstream, quote unquote, constructivist, although he differs from Wendt or some others, but not really the purely, American kind. So Amitav was able to publish and contribute many writings on global IR, on constructivism, on critical theory, and global IR. Now, I myself, of course, have been able to contribute to some of the mainstream, quote unquote, concepts like security dilemma, defensive realism, or ethno conflict. Now, but the very important thing is, at the same time, both of us also aim for moving toward more inclusive global IR. And here, I think there are two things which I like to highlight. So the first thing is we actually should reject those writings that cannot really engage with Western-centric IR literature with sufficient or adequate knowledge, or those who can only engage with the so-called three big isms, right? So those things are part of our basic training of IR study, but they are not really sufficient for more critical and in-depth engagement with Western IR literature. Mm-hmm. Second sub-point I would like to make is we also need to reject those that only engage Western-centric IR literature per se, in the sense they are really good at Western IR literature, but they only want to contribute to Western-centric literature. So here, I actually mentioned it before, I cannot really help but actually to take a shot at some of the Chinese economics and sociology, in the sense these two fields have been so focused on China alone and nothing else. And therefore their goal, many of the young scholars, their only goal is actually to blend into that scene, to only study China and then try to publish China's story in the top 5 or top 15 journals, right? That's the only intellectual objective, which I found really depressing, right? So I would argue the IR field in China has an inherent advantage in terms of internationalization, in the sense we need to study other countries, other civilizations, other regions. In contrast, economics and sociology in China do not really seem to care anything other than China itself. So the third major point I want to argue is we actually have to be aware that some topics are essentially US-centric, Western-centric, and China-centric. So these topics cannot really hope to advance toward global IR per se. So let me give one example for each, right? So I would argue, for instance, I actually wrote about reputation for resolve, but as I actually allude to in my earlier contribution, the concern for reputation for resolve is actually an American obsession, because American has to be concerned about its own reputation for resolve, because there's so many alliances, so many military bases, and therefore it wants to project its largely deterrent image on the cheap. Therefore, if there is some kind of reputation for resolve, then perhaps other countries will be able to submit to American hegemony and American dominance, right? Similarly, American primacy has also been American obsession. American primacy, hegemonic stability, and so to some extent, when non-Western IR or Chinese scholars write about hegemonic stability, primacy, you actually have to be aware that whenever you contribute to discussion, you actually have to know that this particular topic is mostly American obsession. Now, there's some other topics are purely European centric. For instance, a large part of the literature of comparative regionalism, that is European Union versus all the others, which Amtav has also criticized, that is a very European centric, including normative power by the European Union. So likewise, the Tianxia notion, the tributary system, and China versus nomadic enemies or neighbors are all mostly China-centric. So the fourth point I want to make is we actually also have to move beyond West and ourselves. And that's why with Professor Yu Zheng, with Professor Li Xiaoyun in China Agricultural University, we actually have been advocating, say, Chinese scholars have to study not just the United States, not just Europe, not just China, but have to move to beyond, say, Africa, Latin America, and South Asia or Central Asia, so that actually we know, or at least we have some perspective from those regions in order to enrich our understanding about the future. Fifth, it's very important that we actually facilitate more intra non-Western engagement scholarly-wise. For instance, something like this. So I would argue there have been much increase in the within non-Western exchanges culturally, commercially, and politically. But the scholarly community within the non-Western countries have not really been able to caught up with the trend overall. So to some extent, I can actually detect many of the Chinese scholars too. We still prefer to interact with Western colleagues, right? More, right? So if we want to visit other countries, the first country we want to visit is the United States or UK. That's not really good, not healthy. So actually we have to broaden our scope for understanding. And I would argue this has to change. Six, it's very important for me to actually emphasize this particular point in this particular night, because many of the members in the audience are professors or teachers or research fellows in universities, think tanks. So we actually have to teach global IR. We have to teach IR globally in the sense it's mandatory in our IR syllabus. We need to include more readings from non-Western IR scholars. And I actually look at some of the syllabus published by many of our young Chinese colleagues. And I would say 95, 99% of the reading are from the West. It's not good. We actually have to understand the West only represent one particular section of the humankind, and they only represent one particular perspective, not a monolithic perspective, but a fairly European-centric perspective on global IR. So, and I would argue our university, like our school, perhaps we should demand our syllabus to include at least 10 to 20% readings from non-Western IR scholars. And I would encourage everyone in the audience, whether you are a student, whether you are a professor, to actually go back to look at your syllabus, see whether you have included non-Western IR writings. Right? The seventh point I want to make is global IR must be able to inform, criticize, and construct foreign policy. So now, many of you perhaps have kind of noticed actually have been moving away from the IR community. To some extent, my interest has shifted to non-IR fields, but I actually maintain a very active interest in understanding what kind of things drive foreign policy. Now, so unless global IR can inform, criticize, and actually contribute to foreign policy making, and I would argue global IR or non-Western IR will not really have such tangible impact upon how the global affairs are constructed. Now, but it's very important to be cautious here, right? So global IR or Chinese IR is not to defend or justify the foreign policy of our own countries. It will be able to critique and inform and actually contribute to the making of foreign policy. Now, The second sub-point is here is the foreign policy of our country should really constitute a domain for our critical study. And we should be able to critique of them whenever necessary. So therefore, I would argue, if China really wants to build its soft power, it really needs to open more space for discussion, for discussing Chinese foreign policy toward Western countries, non-Western countries, NGOs, etc., etc. So otherwise, we will not be able to project much of a global voice. Finally, I repeat one of the kind of suggestions I actually made back in 2015 or 16. So I think it will be really good or even desirable to have one let's say, Asia Journal of International Relations. So right now in Asia, there are so many country anchored journals in Asia, right? So in Korea, we have several journals. In Japan, we have several journals. And in China, we have one or two. And in India, quite a few. But we really don't have a pan-Asia IR journal. So something like the European Journal of International Relations. I know this is different, but I think perhaps, Amitav and perhaps with other leading Chinese scholars from China, like Professor Qin Yaqing or Yan Xuetong, perhaps we can push for a pan-Asia IR journal, which will have the editorial board from Asian countries. In that, I would say, improve our contribution to the whole global IR movement. So let me stop here, and I hope I have be able to get it done within about 30 minutes. Thank you so much.